I would like to acknowledge that we're filming this on the stolen unceded lands of the Arernte people, and I acknowledge their elders past and present and any elders to rise in the future. We don't think of the colony in Australia, and Australians are as aware of the colony as a fish is of water. It permeates everything around us, from the car park just over there on this walk to the path I'm sitting next to. It's everywhere. The colony is all permeating, and it is the very landscape in which we live, psychologically and sociologically. It's the colony, and they don't want us to think of it. They don't want us to think of the colony. They want us to think of Australia as a virgin land, or they want us to think of Australia as a nation that arose out of virgin soil. But that was never the case. Australia was a violent colony, and that is everywhere you look. And yet it is everything we are as a nation, so therefore it is not considered. It is not looked at or imagined or thought about. And that, I think, is what's wrong with it. One of the things that's wrong with this country. If we don't think of the colony, we can't think of what a country or this continent would be without the colony. If we don't think of the colony, we don't do anything about it. If we don't think of the colony, we don't think of colonial violence. If we don't think of the colony will always be what we are. The colony will continue to define us for eternity unless we start realizing the colony is here, and imagining the colony, and understanding the colony, and thinking of a time without the colony, or possibility of without the colony. It's everywhere. There's a lot of flies around here. Like, this place is crawling with flies, and they're really irritating me. But then I think about the fact that in Aboriginal culture, everything has a dreaming, and everything has someone who's responsible for caring for it, even flies. And I've met people who have blowflies and houseflies as their dreaming ancestor, or as their totem. But when you think about Western interpretations of so-called tribal ways, everyone has, in the kind of pseudo-hippie version of indigenous spiritualities, everyone has a totem that's like a big sexy animal, like a wolf or a dingo or a kangaroo. And never in all my life have I met a single white hippie type person whose totem is something like a blowfly, a caterpillar, or even a maggot. It just doesn't happen. And it makes you realize how different ancient pre-Christian ways are compared to modern tribal hippie interpretations of them, when we think of only the big animals needing care. Even wildlife organizations talk about the tigers and the pandas, often to their detriment, and they ignore the landscape, the mouse, the lizard, the fly, the butterfly, all things that are important have their place in nature. And that's one of the differences between Western culture and Indigenous culture. In Indigenous culture, everything and everybody has its place. The tree behind me is one of the biggest trees in this area, and almost certainly therefore one of the oldest. Now, I'm not sure what species it is. It looks like a river gum of some sort, river red gum perhaps. But the thing about eucalypts that grow in riverbeds, like this one does, is they need flooding. The young trees take root after a flood. And as flooding has been reduced by global warming, there's been less young trees taking root in old riverbeds and on the edge of old riverbeds. This riverbed's dry, and yet there's an ancient tree in it. So that means the water flows here. And everywhere you see a large river gum sort of tree, it means water has flooded through there. And there's ancient trees like this in the middle of the town of Alice Springs. And we know already that the town used to flood, even if we didn't know that the trees needed flooding to take root. But because of the colonisation and the settlement and the town built there, there's been moves have been made to stop the river flooding. They got flood control of various kinds, like drains, to stop the river flooding into the street. And there are no new river gums growing in Alice Springs. And when the old ones get too ancient and fall over, there won't be any new young trees to replace them. So the colonial habit of controlling nature has caused damage to the tree populations in some areas, so that beautiful trees like this one might no longer grow. And that's a disaster for the environment. We need to remember that before colonisation, most waterways in Australia used to regularly flood. I'm sitting in Tjoritja National Park, which stretches from Mparntwe all the way to Ntaria, Hermannsburg, where Albert Namatjira was born. This is the landscape that Namatjira so often painted. I'd like to do a reading from Lies Damn Lies, from the chapter debunking the Australian Pygmies. Settler colonialism is a process designed to overwhelm land and culture, to replace the people and culture that existed before the colonizers arrived, and has a capacity and intention to control all aspects of a society. Entire societies are created on stolen land. New societies that pretend separation from their foundational culture, but maintain cultural fidelity to it. History, culture, and people are all warped by the system that is delighted to lie to justify its existence. When I was in school, I was taught that Aboriginal people had migrated here from India a couple of thousand years ago. This was a common belief of the time, and many still believe it. The origins of this belief are easy to trace. Anthropologists Joseph Birdsall from the US and Norman Tyndall from South Australia hypothesised, based on their 19th century race theories, that there must have been 3 separate migrations into Australia before Europeans arrived. Long after their theories stopped being credible, the colonisers still wrote about them, and one of Tyndall's books, collaborating with H.A. Lindsay, The First Walkabout, was intended for children and novelised an encounter between an Australian pygmy, or negrito to use Tyndall's words, and a modern Aboriginal person. This book starts with the lines, and I quote, "This is a story about the prehistoric people who lived in Australia long before our present-day Aborigines arrived here. Many books have been written about prehistoric peoples of other lands, but most of us didn't even know that a race such as the Negritos did inhabit our country." That's from Tyndall and Lindsay, The First Walkabout. It is to be noted here that by the time The First Walkabout was published, the tri-hybrid hypothesis of Aboriginal origins was already collapsing, and Tyndall would surely have understood that. The Pygmies never existed. There were never Negritos in Australia. They were a myth intended to maintain an outdated theory of race and human origins long after it should have ended. It's possible that the popularity of the tri-hybrid hypothesis and its longevity rise directly from The First Walkabout. There's another later book in my collection, also problematic, by Norman Tyndall and Beryl George, called The Australian Aborigines. Published in 1979 after I was born, by then the tri-hybrid model of Aboriginal origins was already on its last legs. This, a self-identified non-fiction picture book for young people, incorrectly positions the debunked and outdated tri-hybrid theory as established fact. It should not be surprising that some continue to believe outdated theories about Aboriginal people's origins. The average white Australian is not particularly well informed about our history, Aboriginal history, or even their own history, the history of the colony. Of course, they would have even less knowledge of anthropology, a topic that typically few follow. However, the main purpose of false narratives about Aboriginal origins is political. The main role those theories serve as propaganda. It would be significantly easier to promote the belief that colonising Australia is acceptable if the Aboriginal people had already taken the land from an older culture, and if Europeans were merely the third or fourth wave of invaders, the fourth people on this continent. It's really lovely sitting here as the sun is setting in the hills, listening to the wildlife and hoping that one of the endangered rock wallabies comes out to say hi, though I don't think there's much chance of seeing them. They're quite seriously endangered. This place is really quiet and really still and peaceful, except that it's like a major tourism site, and every time we try and relax or try and film, there's modular tourists walking through here to go down to the waterhole that's almost certainly sacred, like all waterholes are, but is not really got that much water in it. And not far from me, just over there, over that way, there's a no swimming sign. So technically I'm not supposed to be swimming where I'm sitting right now, and well, obviously I'm not. And it just makes me realise how oppressive the concept of the colony is. People driving in cars to go look at a waterhole where once people would have lived. It's a really beautiful waterhole. It's right behind me. It's permanent fresh water. There were wallabies to eat, a couple of rock figs, and people would have been able to live here. And now it's a national park with a short walking track for people to walk down to the waterhole and back again. And not this time, but last time we were here, we saw a couple of wadulars walking towards the waterhole, past the no swimming sign, carrying towels and wearing bathers. Firstly, not knowing that the waterhole is only a few inches deep right now, but also not knowing, or not caring, even though it's been a rule for a while, say by the sign, that they're not supposed to swim here. And yet they were wearing bathers and carrying towels. And it reminds me that everywhere you go in Australia, anywhere where there's standing water in the north of the country without crocodiles in it, some wadula, or a bunch of them, will insist on going there swimming. Even to the point where they build ladders and landings in waterholes, which would have been important to sustain life, just so people can go swimming in them. Australia, it really is very red. The landscape here, around here, is mostly red rocks, and that's kind of common through the entire continent. And it's stunning and it's beautiful, and the red of the rocks and the sand was embedded in the Aboriginal flag by Howard Thomas when he designed it. But the red rocks are also an interesting problem, because it's the red rocks that mining companies dig up and turn into money. And it's the mining companies who are one of the main oppositions to Aboriginal land rights. It's mining companies who do stuff like blow up sacred sites in order to dig some more of this red rock out of the ground. And the thing is, what Australia doesn't understand is when mining companies are digging up red rock, it's not their rock. It doesn't belong to them. They have no rights to it. And one thing I constantly bring up in Lies Down Lies, and in a lot of my other writing, is that in Australia, land rights is seen as mining companies have the default right to mine, and people who are opposed to mining on their sacred country have to fight for that right, and that's the wrong way around. Land rights should be by default, and the mining companies should be coming to us, Indigenous people, to beg for the right to mine anywhere, because it's not theirs, and they don't even have to pay for the land when they dig it up. And it's disgusting, and it's actually one of the worst flaws in Australia's society, this idea that mining companies have the right to dig holes in the ground. We're really running out of daylight. Thank you for joining me. Lies Down Lies is out now with Ultimo Press in Australia. If you want more information and to hear more from me, click the subscribe button, follow me on Instagram or follow me on Twitter. Thanks for watching.